first want to say a huge thank you to everyone at Pages of Hackney for doing this, and it's my great honor to be talking to Tareq. So I think Tareq's going to start with the reading.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I was told which reading to read, which which I'm very grateful for. So this is almost halfway through the book, and it's really a very brief scene that happens between me and the other protagonist in the book, Ramzi, who was my neighbor and someone who I had a very strong friendship with. I invited him to the Dead Sea, where my family was spending the Easter holiday that year. It would do us good, I thought, to be in a different space. My parents did not object. He had become an extension of our unit. I was giddy for the lake and its surroundings, and more privately, for the prospect of sharing a hotel room with him. We had spent countless nights in the same room, but a hotel was thrilling, a blank canvas. Filtered light and lifeless hills marked our steep descent into the Jordan Valley. 45 minutes south of Amman, we were in the depths of the earth, an unworldly place, pressurized, hot, stupor-inducing. Our sense of time altered. Everything slowed down, and within hours, we were all sluggish, nourished by the air, marveling as our skin was turned to silk by the salts in the water. Days dissolved in the heat, and come nighttime, we were drained. Wakefulness next to him gave way to deep sleep. On our last day, we were in the lake, floating cross-legged. Uncharacteristically peaceful, I stretched out on my back on the surface of the water and bobbed up and down in the current, waves lapping at my neck and ears and rays warming my tummy. Golden circles swam behind my eyelids as I dozed off. It must have been only a few minutes later that I sat up. I had drifted a good way from where Ramzi, my parents, and my brothers were floating. I looked back. All their attention was fixated on him. Mama's laughter carried over to my ears. My brothers were on either side of him. Baba was listening so intently that he did not notice my drift. He was fearful of the Dead Sea and its notorious currents, and would normally have called me to move closer. I can see the sun's gold on the waters between us, the hotel in the background, the only sign of life. All around, barren mountains and a haze in the horizon where Palestine lay, barely detectable. A thought burst into my mind, at once strangely familiar and utterly threatening in its foreignness. A sensation that had long been known but had remained unformed. He fit into my family. Effortlessly floating in the lake, the saltiness of the water tickled the back of my throat. He had crossed into the private realm of our lives. Mama and Baba had let their guard down, no longer performing civility around him, and my brothers had long thought him a better match than me. He fits. I squinted, looking at him, all bathed in sunlight, as this thought crystallized in my mind. I hadn't invited him along as my friend. The sulfuric water added to the claustrophobia closing in. I sat up abruptly, too abruptly, my arms and legs jerking ungracefully, and the next wave, although gentle, tipped me over, splashing salty water all over my face. I closed my eyes against the familiar sting. I love you. Sour water landed on my mouth. I gagged. The dense waters of this Dead Sea made it hard to breathe. I needed to get to shore to splash fresh water over my burning face, but with my eyes firmly shut against the sting, I had no idea in which direction I needed to swim.
Thank you so much. I think one of the great triumphs of this book, or for me why this book is a triumph, is because it shows us that there's no kind of neat division between desiring pleasure, sensuousness, and the domain of the political. I think in telling your story, you're giving us a sense of how these two things are intimately enmeshed, and how our lives are always lived at this point of excess, how there's always this kind of overspill. And so I guess I wanted to start with this question of memory and of fabulation. I think one thing that you do in the book, which is kind of exampled or exemplified in the piece that you just read, is the turning of people, the characters of people in your lives into figures, right? Into characters in and of themselves in the book. And I think you're playing a lot with fabulation. You're not treating memory as if it were stable. And I wanted to ask, I guess, in the writing of the book, talk to me about that narrative and stylistic decision. Were you kind of conscious of that this was perhaps the best way to approach an unwieldy past? And were you kind of anxious about the failure of memory to render the whole story?
Absolutely. I was very troubled by unreliability, by the fact that I knew my memory was unreliable. And this discomfort with it took many forms. You know, at the beginning when I was writing, there was always this question of, do I fictionalize? And what's the separation between fiction and nonfiction? How do I hold on to something that I know is true, but actually that the grounding of which is completely unreliable and that I have no access to? And in some ways, there were some aspects of the writing that gave me some stability. So, for example, Ramzi and I and our relationship took place over letters. That's how our relationship grew, through correspondence. We would write to each other. And so I have 8 years worth of his letters with me. That's an archive, right? I don't have access to the letters I wrote to him, but I have ways to try to reconstruct what I might have written, given what his responses were, or given how he might have taken a position against this thing or that. And so I had something that would give me a form of stability, but I was still very aware of the fact that there was no way I could render truth. There was no way that I could reconstruct my childhood. I just couldn't. And so at the same time, I felt that I didn't want to go in the direction of fiction. There was something that was important for me about owning that narrative as nonfiction and owning it as memoir, and we can talk about that decision. And so what I was left with was this challenge of trying to work through memory in as much as possible to try to reconstruct events. And the way that and this was a very conscious sort of, I was troubled by this. And also as a scholar, this notion that you want to try to reconstruct the archive in some kind of semblance to the truth, you know, whatever. And this is, you know, you and I were talking about this, but this is where Sayeeda Hartman and her work was important, because this sense of imagining archive, or not understanding archives as real, and imagining them as places that you could go to in order to try to reconstruct through the gaps in the archives. And so for me, the letters were the backbone, but I allowed myself some kind of liberty in terms of reconstructing that childhood. The one thing that I thought that I needed to hold onto as a marker that would be loyal to the fact that I wasn't tipping into fiction, is that what I wanted to recreate was the authenticity of a feeling, the emotional depth of the feeling. You know, the events might be debatable. It might have happened around this corner or that corner. It might have happened in 1996 or 1997. But the emotional resonance, the emotional echoes of those events were truthful in as far as I could remember them and had lived them and processed them. And so it was important for me to define that, you know, what is it that I'm reconstructing and what is truth? What is the fact, quote unquote, that I'm trying to sort of render legible to the reader?
Yeah, I think what you're saying makes me think of, you know, how Hartman describes the act of critical fabulation as jeopardizing the status of the event. And I think when you're attempting to go straight to the heart of it, when you're attempting to speak to feeling, that in a way makes the events of the past feel sturdier than they otherwise would. And I think crucially it allows you to render characters, people like your mother and father in their fullness and in their complexity, right? Because you're not only speaking of them as their child, you're trying to recreate a sense of them as people, as you know, desirous subjects, as people who, you know, have their own kind of dreams and hopes and visions. I guess there are also quickly all of these ways in the book that you're coding information crucially for Arabic speakers. And I wanted to also talk about two things. I wanted to talk about the use of fragmentation in relation to that question of archive, but also talk to me about the kind of politics of language that ability to obscure information and what that offers you as a writer, as somebody who is trying to deal with what you called an unsteady past?
I have a complex relationship with language. And I talk a bit about this in the book, this sense of feeling alienated from Arabic because I thought that I couldn't quite find myself in its words, in its utterings, in its enunciations. And so in my past, just found my escape from a place that I thought was deeply intolerant of who I was. I found my escape linguistically, and I turned to English. And I trouble that, and I sort of think about it, and I question it, and I live to undo that. So this is still an ongoing process for me, but it was certainly a struggle. At the same time, I'm deeply aware of my positionality writing as a queer Palestinian in English, and how easily that gets co-opted and how easily that gets politicized in ways that are not aligned with the values that I have and who I am. And so I just very aware of the Western gaze on my writing. And so there was no way I could have written this book or frankly any book that was autobiographical or intimate if I was aware of that Western gaze, right? So I needed to just hide it. I needed to obscure it. And so the way that I actually wrote this book was in letter form. I wrote this book to Ramzi. The book started as Dear Ramzi, and that allowed me to make sure that in my mind he was my only reader. So he was the person I was speaking with, a Palestinian man on the other end of the letter. And so that meant not only that if I would write in Arabic that he would understand, but also that the politics that are embedded in this book, I don't have to explain. I don't have to tell him what Deir Yassin was or what Tel Zatar was. I don't need to explain. I don't need to do the work of explaining. And that it was important for me to do that, because especially for something that I thought was about rendering my childhood and holding on to that authenticity, I didn't want that mediated through the West, right? Which is difficult since I'm writing in English. And so the letter form gave me structure, and then the use of Arabic helped me disrupt the Western gaze. So people might not be able to read the words. And that was important. This sort of, what I imagined a sense of discomfort or alienation was something that is part of the book for me. This sort of, I imagined a reader being a voyeur, coming to a conversation that was happening between two Arab men, and I wanted to hold on to that.
Yeah, I think when I was reading the book, there were two kind of quotes that were in my head. This quote from June Jordan where she says, poetry means taking control of the language of your life. And this other quote from Anne Carson, she says, if you're not the free person you want to be, you must find a place to tell the truth about that, to tell how things go for you. And I think before we were talking about the power of enunciation and how when you come from a specific kind of political subjecthood, like as you're saying, like as a queer Arab man, there are all of these ways that your enunciation is weighted by discourses around coming out, discourses around diasporic memory, etc. But I think that what this book shows us is that the power of speaking is about the ability to dignify one's life, the ability to give autonomy to a specific kind of narrative. And maybe a non-queer reader reads that as like brave or vulnerable. But actually, when I was reading, I was thinking, you speak because you don't want to die. And like, that's what really comes across to me. And it feels like you're giving us a way in kind of detailing this relationship with Ramzi. You're giving us a sense that your speaking is not only a speaking to him, but a speaking to the world, and that those two things are joined. So I wanted you to, I guess, tell us the value then of, telling how things go for you, the value of showing us that there is this reciprocal relationship between the world and oneself.
Well, I really appreciate this thinking of, not being able to enunciate is a form of dying. I mean, for me, I really think of this book as writing my way into being. It really is the way that I made space for myself, and it's materially I didn't need to do that. I'm living in London. I'm living with my partner. There is a space and a home for me, but there it was a way of forcing a life into the silences that I grew up in. You know, forcing a certain kind of reality and owning it. And I think that's where the dignity comes in, sort of rising above this sense of, you know, are we hiding because of shame, or are we hiding because we're telling ourselves that as queer folk we want to maintain our environments, and we want to sort of stay in the shadows because this is where we exist as queer folk. And I think in some ways both of these things are true. But for me, a sense of owning my narrative publicly was in some ways an act of affirming my dignity, that I can do this and I want to do this and I'm choosing to do this. But I think it's a very complicated reality, because I do think that, you know, I think a lot, and we were talking about this, I think a lot about queer folks back home, where actually there is something about living in the margins, and there is something about living in silence. There is something about not wanting the spotlight, because the spotlight comes with state repression. More visibility is dangerous, and I think it's important to also not enunciate, and it is important to be invisible, but on what terms, and what's the cost of doing things like that. And so I was very aware of my positionality, the privilege I have, but also thinking about the collective and what queerness means, and what it means to sort of choose to be visible or to be invisible, choose to enunciate or not to enunciate. But for me, there was something about writing against the silence that I grew up with, that felt like it was actually a place for all of my rage and all of the sort of the shame that I grew up in to be funneled back out of me.
Yeah,
right?
And I think crucially this question of enunciation is not necessarily a question of recognition or the enunciation through the lens of identity. Like for me, and what you show us in this book is that enunciation is about a bringing together of like the conceptual and the material. Like it's about this way of thinking about what one is going to do and their orientation, your orientation towards freedom. So all of these groups that you're talking about are also enunciating in some sense when they're trying to find resources for queer people, when they are trying to like meet people's needs. And I think that in the book there isn't this kind of either or. I wanted to ask you also then, I think that perhaps some people in the context of your other writings on kind of Palestinian resistance might be tempted to ask, I guess, why the move to memoir, and what does memoir offer? But I was going back to your previous book, and it didn't surprise me that it began with Lorraine Hansberry. Like it began with her plays as a way of thinking about the moral ambiguity inherent to politically resisting. And so much of this book also, whilst you're thinking about the intimate and the personal, thinks about your life in the context of generational displacement. You know, your grandmother's displacement from Haifa, and then your parents from Beirut, and then going into Amman. And eventually you, when you come to London and when you attempt to kind of create your life. I wanted to ask you then about this question. Do you think that this is a kind of through line that connects your work, this idea of resistance, this idea of trying to understand one's life in a political context?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think consciously. It's interesting. It's interesting to think about a through line between the first book and the second, because they're such different books. But actually, there is a through line, and it is. I think you're sort of you're circling around. It has something to do with moral ambiguity, and it has something to do with resistance. I think in both books, even though the form is very different, the place of writing comes from a place of, or the origin of the writing comes from a place of discomfort. That there's something in me that is uncomfortable with a certain lack of understanding and of witnessing how narratives get co-opted and simplified and made into binaries, sort of reduced into binaries. I think obviously with Hamas Contained, the role of Palestinian resistance, just not just thinking about how it's demonized in the West, it's beyond that. It's thinking about the real moral ambiguity around resistance, the form of resistance, what it means to resist, what it means to resist with arms. All of these questions are questions that require a lot of internal soul searching, where one stands, how one deals with these things. And similarly with this book, even though it's a memoir, it's really, I'm troubled by questions around visibility, invisibility, around queerness, around the place of queer folks in the world, how they exist in the margins, but also are seeking to not be in the margins. The sort of thinking about the politics around queer bodies and how they get co-opted inadvertently, and so it even though it's not a scholarly book, it was troubled by that moral ambiguity and by the instinctive need to resist, right? To resist powers, to resist hegemonic structures, to resist violence, and so I do think that in this book and in the first book, that's a story not just of myself, it's a story of collectives, but it's also a story of generations, and there's a depth, both horizontal and sort of to both of these questions. And it's interesting for me that I grapple with them in different ways. In some ways, I think this is a far more political book than Hamas Contained, because I think academic work, you can still hide in academic writing. You can't hide in memoir, or you shouldn't hide in memoir. And so, I mean, I think it's there. I'm troubled by, or I guess the beginning of my writing is these niggling sources of discomfort.
And I feel like it's impossible, I guess, to think about this book without thinking about the violence that is encasing this kind of these intimate scenes. And I think in doing that, you're giving us a more expansive understanding of what it means to love someone. So obviously, like, Ramzi is a central node in this book, and as the book kind of goes on, your fictionalizing of him or your remembering of him kind of dissembles. And I'm thinking towards the very end, when you're kind of fabulating or imagining what it might mean to meet him at a different kind of stage in your life. But crucially, I think, what you're doing is giving us a more expansive idea of love that moves us beyond the scarcity principle. That you can be deeply moved and transformed by a range of people in your life. That you can. It doesn't have to. It's not necessarily always contained in this kind of understanding of monogamy and marriage and et cetera, et cetera. So I guess the question in all of that is: do you think of loving and the writing of your experience of loving as trying to move us beyond just into intimate partnership towards an orientation towards freedom? Like, what's your relationship between trying to rethink like eros and love as you're writing?
I mean, I think it's thinking about love in a very political way. I mean, it's sort of more thinking about it in Baldwinian love as versus sort of more romantic love. I think it's placing love within environments and sensibilities and contexts that expand beyond just the two people, and that bring in the wider reality that those two people are existing in. So I think it's whoever Ramzi is today, and whatever he might think if he were to read this book, what the kind of relationship that we had, the kind of love that I had for him, animated me. It made me who I am today in many ways, and shaped me as someone who is, political and committed to resistance. And so when I sort of bring him back in this imaginary sort of echo of who he might be, I'm less interested in him necessarily as a person. I'm more interested in my projection onto him. What is this man that I imagine, this sort of image of the perfect man that, in my childhood, I would have thought this is what I needed to aspire to be, this straight, successful, corporate, good-looking father and husband. This is certainly not the man I am today, and it's not the man that I want to be, nor should I ever have aspired to be. So in terms of my love for him, and I'm then wondering what was it that I loved, and how did that then inform me and inform my politics and inform my being, and what's real and what's imagined, and how does that sort of then fit into this broader context, around the world that we grew up in, the world that we thought we had to abide by, as versus this other world that we could imagine and midwife into being.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the part in Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, where he's talking about this moment of interpellation where he, you know, this like white girl says like, look, a Negro, and he's I think he says something like, you know, I came into this world wanting to understand it and wanting to find the source of things, but then I realized I was an object amongst other objects. Right. And there's something in what you're saying in terms of like those wounding or transformative or deeply moving experiences that you have are means of recognition, but are a means of through which you understand who you are and what you want. And it's like, I think this experience or reading this book, there were so many ways that I was recognizing that you recognize your younger self as like deeply penetrable in a way, as vulnerable. And that also then orientated you towards freedom or orientated you towards an understanding of resistance.
It forced a certain desire to escape, and in that to resist. I mean, it was everything became contingent. You know, it's not immutable. I don't have to take what I'm given. I can fight against it, and I can find an alternative.
Absolutely.
And I think trying to capture that moment, trying to sort of go back to, and that does come through love. I loved him, and so it was a love that animated that desire for something else, right? And so I think that's where I think about love in a much more expansive, form.
I guess also you invoked Baldwin, so let's go there. And the title of this book, Fire in Every Direction, it immediately made me think about The Fire Next Time. And then that took me to how you engage and how you think about your mother. Like we're talking about animation, and I think your mother animates this book. And I'm interested in always in this question of how we write mothers as a feminist thinker, because I guess like you show us how the nuclear family structure and the demands of gendered reproduction meant that this fire that was inside of your mother, her desire and willingness to resist as a student in Beirut was, you know, in some ways extinguished, in some ways kind of caged or moved along. And you also talk about this moment in the book where her friend Mona is murdered in the Tal al-Zatar refugee camp in 1976. And I think as I was reading, I was thinking, you know, perhaps it's too simplistic to say, and this is not what you're saying, but perhaps it's too simplistic to say your mother's fire was simply dimmed or extinguished. Can we think about it as a kind of dream deferred, like following Langston Hughes? Can we think about the way that gender shapes participation in political struggle? I guess this is a kind of broad, like sprawling question about passion and about gender, because I also, as I was reading this book, sorry, this is a very long question, but as I was reading this book, I was thinking about the ways that gender is also in school, the ways that you and your peers kind of came together and formed your attachments through this idea of like thinking about women's bodies and drawing these kind of rude cartoons. So I'm wondering then, what gender's doing in this book for you?
I really didn't think about this consciously when I began writing, but when I finished the book, I realized that this book was very much about an inheritance of resistance down the maternal line. I was raised very much by my maternal grandmother, so she was a big, when we landed in Jordan, both of my parents were struggling to make ends meet, and we were left in her care often. And so she was a rock in our family. She took care of us. She raised us, and she's the one who got dispossessed from Palestine. But in many ways, she was the most silent about Palestine. And I felt an inheritance. Now I can understand an inheritance that wasn't verbalized at the time. My mom was the opposite of that, and the title of the book, Fire in Every Direction, is in reference to her rage, which I sort of talk about as her spewing fire in every direction in Jordan, because she was an angry woman, and our household, my childhood home was filled with rage. And actually, it took me a long time. As a child, rage is a scary thing to behold, and I think it took me a long time to understand my mother's rage. And I realized after I finished writing the book, I used to say before that I got to the place where I could forgive my mom's rage because I could understand it. I could understand the injustice. I feel the rage now. And she showed me that I was able to touch her rage in a way that once I had the political maturity, I could understand it, and in that way, I could forgive it. But actually, after I finished writing this book, I realized that it wasn't for me to forgive, that it was actually something I was grateful for, because she showed me that this is how you must exist. I mean, if you're not feeling this rage against these systems that are enacting these injustices on our bodies, then something is deeply wrong, right? And so my mom lands from this sort of fiery activist thinking about Palestinian liberation in Lebanon with her comrades, one of whom gets killed, and she lands in Jordan. And not only is this a context where her politics is unacceptable, because Jordan is a very sanitized place, it's very conservative, you know, there's no room for politics. So not only is she dealing with grief and dealing with the loss of this sort of utopian imaginary vision of liberating Palestine, she's also coming into a society that's very conservative, that's patriarchal. Suddenly her expansive, fluid relationship with her boyfriend, my father, turns into a marriage when it's not necessarily what she had anticipated or been prepared for or wanted. And suddenly she goes from, you know, being a revolutionary in training to becoming a mother. And I think there's something about the way that, you know, talking about I mean, I don't think that her politics ever dulled. You should hear her when I'm talking to her now about the war in Iran. She's ready to go. But it's not a dulling of the but there is something about the way that these external worlds contain and sort of force a diminishment or a shrinking that's very violent. And then there's nowhere for that energy to go. There's no way for that imaginary alternative to be. And I think where it went for us is in us, as in I think she sort of deposited that within us in her raising of us.
And it makes sense if you're kind of so much of your early kind of life was defined by her rage, that enunciation is also your inheritance, right? Like it makes sense then to speak. It makes sense that you're writing again about resistance. I also, as you were talking, I was thinking also about all of these moments in the book where your father projects his fear onto your mother, because your father doesn't know what to do with the sublimation of his, you know, right to resist, his ability to understand the dissonance between what should come to pass and what is, right?
And the way that often happens in very sexist ways, very gendered ways, you know, he's rational, he's pragmatic, she's the one who's irrational, she's the one who's angry. He understands the politics, he understands the power, she's just idealistic and utopian. And I think this is very gendered language. I mean, it really gets one thinking about masculinity and what that is. What is this project that men are holding on to?
Two questions then on that. Also, I guess on the question of masculinity, I think when I was reading the book, especially when you're talking about, you know, you and Ramsey in school and the way that you perceive him to be like kind of endlessly charming and open and a kind of perfect vision of what, you know, the society you're in would want men to be. I think there are also ways that you're harsh on yourself, as what you see is the opposite of that, as the kind of more kind of reserved, you know. I think at one point you say passive, but I actually think like in recalling this way, you're being quite active. But I guess I wonder, all of those experiences to me seem caged in an understanding of your inability to perform masculinity correctly, and the forms of humiliation that incurs. And I'm wondering, how your relationship then to masculinity has been shaped and changed by your life as it stands, and how you've grown and changed as a person.
Absolutely. I mean, I think initially this sense of, I think performance is exactly the right word, sort of understanding that this is a script, and I needed to follow the script. And I wanted to follow the script, not just needed. It was a script that I wanted. You know, I wanted to be popular and good at football and, you know, funny and witty and attracted to girls, and everything that he was, I wanted to be. And I tried. And I think my experience, or my sort of childhood experience with queerness, was failure to not be queer. It was sort of, I wanted to not be this, I wanted to be that. And so with that, there's humiliation. That's obviously from, people noting that, you're not playing by the script, so there's something off, but also shame internal that why can I not be that, and what is wrong with me? And I think it takes a long time, I think, for queer folks to sort of shed that shame and to come out of that script and to understand that that script is a script. I think it takes a long time. I think it's a process, a lifelong process of shedding shame and of learning to write your own script, trying to sort of understand what masculinity, what does it mean for me as a queer person today, what is masculinity? And I think about it in the same way I think about queerness, that it's not just a way of being that's shaping my romantic relationships. It's a political project. It's something that's thinking about power. It's thinking about hegemony. It's thinking about injustice. That's and that's why Palestine is central. I mean, to that question, for me at least, in terms of thinking about queerness, in terms of thinking about masculinity. All of the ways that in childhood it's sort of thinking about, existing in the schoolyard. What are you fighting? What are you fighting for? Questions of honor. How do you protect your sister's honor? And I sort of, all of these concepts that I grew up with that are embedded in my consciousness become questions that are still questions that animate me, but that have nothing to do with that script.
Yeah.
They're sort of,
but then crucially, it's like, how do you protect your sister's honor? How do you protect your nation's honor?
Right,
because
exactly.
that's what
so,
your sister becomes
totally.
a kind of symbol of. I wonder, this kind of takes me to my next question, which is about the relationship between class and class mobility in this, and yourself in this memoir. I think particularly about all of the ways that in fabulating about your mother, you show how she distinguishes herself from somebody like Mona, for example, who lives in a refugee camp. And I think you talk about when, in the movement to Lebanon, your family's circumstances were determined by what you call fascistic policy, right? This idea that Christians were, enabled some access to state resources that was withheld, I think, from Muslims. So I guess I think about this because I think this question is also often elided in the context of Palestine. Like annihilation flattens the hierarchy of a society, right? But in this story, you help us construct a sense of what we know, that like fates and entire lineages are determined by class and religious affiliation. I wondered if you could talk a bit about that in the context of this triple displacement and how that shapes your understanding of your own life now. Like we were talking before, like when you come to London in the memoir, you're also talking about all of these ways that initially you attempted to distance yourself from what you termed a kind of backward Muslimness as a form of assimilation. So I'm wondering also about how that is a class question.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a class question throughout. So first, my grandparents landing in Lebanon, for a few years after 48, Lebanon was playing with the demographics of the country. So they would hand Christian refugees passports, citizenship. Muslim refugees were placed in refugee camps. Obviously, in the end, also Christians were not granted citizenship, but many Christians were able to get citizenship. So already there's privilege there that is just a function of a state privilege. Our lives would have looked fundamentally different if we didn't get those passports, right? And then by the time my parents land in Amman, we're lower middle class. We're sort of my mom and dad are both struggling, and we're not sort of anywhere near comfort. And there's throughout the course of my life and obviously the book, there's a class mobility. So we're firmly middle class by the time I come here. So there is real privilege, there's material privilege, and I'm very self-conscious in the book about the fact that my flight to London is not by war or by violence or I'm not a refugee here. I'm fleeing by choice, and it's a privileged flight. I'm coming, on a flight with citizenship to study here. So it's a very different kind of exile. And I really think about whether exile is the right word, what that kind of estrangement does. All of these questions are questions of privilege and class. And I think that they're important to grapple with because flattening them out, as you say, completely changes the politics of the reality that we're living in. If you think specifically about Palestine and Palestinians, it's in many ways a class struggle. certainly thinking about the role of Palestinian elite, thinking about the divisions between Palestinians on the inside in Palestine, Palestinians on the outside, who has access to what, what Palestinian refugees have in the West Bank versus Palestinian citizens of Israel. So there's a real class and material tension that's animating our politics. And this is historically the case, thinking about Palestinian elite who had access to holds of power in the British Empire as versus the people who were working the land on whom decisions were made that they had no access to, right? So thinking about the way that class politics informs our struggle is really important and increasingly important, because there's a world now in which we look at Palestine and we think about, if you go to Ramallah today, Ramallah is a very comfortable place. You can very easily not see the occupation and live a very comfortable life with a mortgage and a car and have, and class, that kind of privilege and that kind of access has in many ways dulled politics. It's sedated people. It's removed the collective. It's individualized everyone in a very neoliberal sort of politics, right? And so being aware of class, being aware of how it's animating our struggle, I think is fundamental if we're talking about projects of liberation.
And also, I think crucially how Israel and the Zionist project depends on the kind of labor of working class Palestinians and this kind of like conveyor belt of that labor in order to build and sustain the project of annihilation. So it is also a strategy question in terms of like recognizing, I think, these questions about class. I have more questions. I guess I wanted to ask, since we're kind of talking about Palestine, I wanted to ask about how you say in this book two things. One, Palestine had to teach me what was worth fighting for. And two, the power of the abject is revolutionary. And there is this kind of beautiful passage in the book where you think about this book in the context of the ongoing genocide, and you think about the kind of incubation of resistance. So I wondered if you could talk about that passage a little bit, and I wondered if you could talk about this question of abjection, this question and how it, like animates our sense of possibility.
Yeah, I mean, this line about Palestine taught me what's worth fighting for is back to the point we were making about, protecting honor, thinking about masculinity. I think it was very much that. It's, I still want to think about masculinity as a fighting for something, but what is it that we're fighting for? And Palestine and the idea of a free Palestine then becomes central in that consciousness. Thinking about abjection, actually, that was all written before the genocide, and the fact that it's sort of the genocide has just made it pop out in ways that I would have never anticipated. But it's really the abjection specifically is a concept that I've been playing. So it's the powers of the abjection. It's Julia Kristeva. I can't remember the name of her essay, The Power of Horror, I think. Anyway, so she's meditating on this idea of the abject. And I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of how I think about how I come to Palestine through a queer lens, and specifically Gaza, thinking about how, certainly in the Western imaginary, but not only in the Western imaginary, Gaza is seen as this place, and certainly in the Israeli imaginary, seen as this dark place, horrible place, overpopulated, dirty, only terrorists live there. It's really seen in very wretched, very sort of abject terms, when obviously that's not what Gaza is at all. But it's really thinking about what is it that this sort of abjection, this turning things that are beautiful and full of life and revolutionary into things that are despised and things that are horrible and things that must be excised. And that's what queerness is as well, in the heteronormative imaginary, queer folks doing acts that are uncivilized or dirty, and so it's really thinking about how these two things are in conversation with each other, and being attracted to the idea of what happens if what is deemed abject is embraced, and thinking about that as a revolutionary act. So if you go to the place that's ugliest, if you go to the place that's in these imaginaries, assume to be most untouchable and embrace that. What is the power of that? And I think about that in the context of Palestine and in the context of queerness, how both of these identities are explosive. They're not neutral identities. They're political, very visible, very identities that are alive and that are full of potential. And so that for me is revolutionary. And I think sort of going back to the point about silences. It's sort of going in the writing and the things I'm interested in, it's sort of banging my head against things that are unspeakable and talking about them. Because I think in doing that, one is reclaiming something that is deemed beyond, I don't know, beyond, is deemed unworthy or you know, that it shouldn't be reclaimed.
And also in a way kind of exceeds language as well. Like when you're thinking about like what, to me it's interesting to read that passage and to see you also be self-conscious about the inability of language to really convey the complexity of how you're thinking about abjection in the context of Palestine. I remember the line where you say, you know, I don't want to romanticize the struggle, but there's something about abjection that sharpens a contradiction that is in one way, you know, politicizes a particular, you know, groups of people, whilst also in a way doing a grave injustice to the people who exist in that space and in the land and are attempting against all kinds of manner of violence to make life, right? So I think like abjection has to be that bridge through which we understand and meet, you know, human need, and I feel like that's what you're attempting to do. I perhaps actually this might be a good point to pause, and then you can read about your grandmother.
So the section that I'm going to read now is about my effort to find my grandmother's house in Palestine. My husband and I are having breakfast with a retired Palestinian urban planner who had built his career in Haifa's municipality and developed a reputation for mapping the city's streets. Clandestinely, of course. He was, after all, a Palestinian in the heart of Israel's bureaucracy. Here is a man able to juxtapose Haifa's contemporary landscape with the blueprints of the city in 1948, on the edge of calamity, as it remains frozen in time in the minds of all the Nakba survivors who were expelled. Flocks of Palestinians come to him, hoping that he can magically take them back in time and make sense of the vaguest directions that have been passed down from their dying elders. I have come to him with the same such vagueness. Leish ya ibni, Tata implored when I first told her, on a call from London, that I was traveling to Palestine. Why do you want to go there? She asked. I talked her through her fears and into her hopes, untouched for decades, that it is our right to return, that this injustice that had plagued her will not remain a silent, unwanted companion. I reminded her that Mama too had made this journey, and that every generation in our family will claim this right until it is secured. Just like with her recipes, gentle prodding undid her hesitation. Go to the Italian hospital, she told me. Keep it on your right-hand side. Turn right just before you get to the actual hospital. From there, it's the first left and second right. Our house is the one on the corner closest to the sea, a 2-story villa. I had no street name or house number. She could recall neither. Is there any point walking in the back streets behind the hospital? There is, our urban planner tells us, handing us books about Haifa's topography. That area has not been leveled and little has changed. The plot sizes and street names have all been altered, obviously, but the general skeleton of the area has been preserved. Just follow her directions, he says, and see where you find yourself. We thanked him and set off. The midday sun beats down on us as we walk along the busy main road away from Haifa's main strip and towards the Italian hospital. It's hot and I'm anxious. We have spoken about this before, my husband and I. There might be a chance that the house will never be found, but that is in some ways a more straightforward outcome than finding it. Because what then? Will I knock on its front door? Will I ask to see it? What if the house is inhabited by an Israeli family? Or worse, an American Jewish family just summering there, holding Tata's home hostage to their vacations? Will they be aggressive if I introduce myself as the original occupant's grandson? What will they make of us, bursting into the middle of their day, asserting belonging, living proof of crimes they have inherited and abetted? No clear answers have been reached by the time we come up to a building that our phones tell us is the Italian hospital. Neither of us says anything as we take the ride just before the hospital and walk down to the street behind it. First left. The area is quiet with none of the highway traffic spilling over. The streets are wide and olive trees are planted on the sidewalks. We could be in Amman or Beirut. The houses are mostly villas or small residential buildings, 2 or 3 stories, all limestone, strangely familiar, except for the Hebrew letterings on the front doors and the mezuzahs hanging in the entrances. Second right. We walk down in the direction of the sea. We get to the first crossing, and the house on the other side of the street, closest to the sea, is a 2-story villa. The front gates are shut, black metal, and there is an unwieldy jasmine bush spilling over its walls and lining its entrance. It's a narrow pathway to the front door, a brown wooden frame that appears shut. The ground floor windows are also shuttered. I instinctively turn and look diagonally across the street, a grand villa, the one that had acquired a forlorn look in the weeks before Tata's flight, where her best friend had lived, from where her family had fled, furtively in the middle of the night, to Tata's dismay. I look back at Tata's house, smaller than her friend's, now haloed with new importance. My husband grabs my hand, wordlessly. He knows, I know. We've heard her descriptions. Neither of us needs to say anything. I cross the street and stand by the gate, taking in the scent in the air, looking up at what I imagine was her bedroom, where she was sitting when her father rushed back in, panicked, on that fateful night. She must have stood exactly where I'm standing now and turned around for that final glance, suitcase in hand. Was this the same jasmine bush? Can it be? My mind fixates on this, the bush, its roots, its size. Do jasmine trees live this long? How old would it be now, 7 decades later? My eyes turn back to the house. It looks uninhabited. Or maybe they've just left for the day, whoever they are. What has this house seen in the decades between her and me standing in this spot? What had she seen, other than a lifetime of flight? My chest tightens and I take a step back. I cannot bring myself to ring the doorbell. There's only so much loss one can bear. I do not want to know, do not want to be faced with a family that believes it has a right to be there. Or worse, a kind family that acknowledges this past and then offers us a drink in my home. I want to imagine it empty, loyal, waiting for our return. I want it to exist outside of time, as if everything stopped that April. Their presence or absence is irrelevant, I tell myself. This is about her, about Tata, about me stepping through that fracture that ran along this entrance, physically reconnecting our histories. I have finally bent time, held her history in my present. I walk to the other side of the street and take a picture. I send it to Mama. I think I found it, I write in the caption. She responds immediately. This looks like everything she's described. Where did you find it? How come I couldn't? She writes back. And then a few seconds later, I'm glad she doesn't have the eyesight to see it now.
Thank you. That was really beautiful. I'm going to be really cheeky and compress like 3 questions into one before I open it up to the floor. I think as you were reading that, what I was thinking is that, you know, in saying you want the house to be loyal, you're recognizing that it's kind of doubly wounding for your grandmother to be displaced, but then for you to find the home and to find somebody else kind of in it. And I think that word loyal is, it's really interesting in that context. I guess this also then brings me to my final question, which was about place and belonging. And it makes me think about another section in the book where you're talking about you and your husband kind of going to sleep together and this kind of routine that you have in the way that you hold one another, which reminded me of this poem by Tom Gunn called The Hug. But it's about, like, to me, it seems fitting then in the context of that displacement, in the context of you going back to find your grandmother's home, that you find belonging then in somebody else, you find belonging in another person, which reminds me of the kind of faith of your grandma that like, you know, animates this novel as well. And it ties together this like necessary and life-saving kind of queer exile and this embrace of alienation from the nuclear family with the physical exile that's marked your lineage. So I wanted to ask you finally, you know, how has your idea of place, and I mean this in lots of ways, land, social location, you know, Beirut as a place of resistance, Amman as a place of conservatism, you know, in the imaginary, the connection to the natural world, how has that been shaped or changed in the writing of this memoir?
That's a beautiful question. I mean, listen, I think the Palestinian condition is one of rootlessness. I think until return happens, it's this sense of being connected to a land that we can't quite reach, right? And so there's this sense of dislocation that's constant, and there's no way to fight it. I think about it as a form of enacting return everywhere. So always thinking about the inevitability of return, that even if I can't access Palestine now, I am committed to return. So return becomes an ongoing process, just like the Nakba is ongoing, our commitment to return is ongoing. So that is a way of being. It sort of turns, the land is important and it's the thing that we must liberate, but it also turns our way of living and our thinking about home away from just geography. And it turns it into the spaces we inhabit, the loves that we have, the kind of families that we build. And I think this is, as you say, a queer story as well, but I think this is where queerness and Palestinianness are actually so much in conversation. But so home for me becomes, you know, my husband. It becomes the friendships that I have, the comrades that I'm working with, and that is mobile. It exists in Beirut, it exists in Cape Town, it exists in New York, and it's not tethered to one place. It's expansive, and so it's a way of, I think, turning this sense of dislocation into empowerment, into thinking about, you know, the fact that I'm not on the land that I'm from doesn't mean that I don't belong. It just means that belonging looks different and is lived differently and is enacted differently. And I think that's something that I'm very conscious of and I am sort of very aware of in sort of my day-to-day living.
Thank you. That was a beautiful place to end. We're going to open to questions now, and there isn't a roving mic, so I'm going to have to badly summarize and repeat your questions back to you. Does anybody have a question?
Hi, I love this book. My question is around, there's a point towards the end of the book where you kind of have this italicized like outburst of like rage, stream of consciousness, there's swearing, there's cursing, and then you kind of follow up with an apology, like sorry for this outburst. And I found that really interesting, like made me think a lot about love and rage as often these like emotions would see as opposite, but this is like a moment where your love for Ramsey descends into this like rage, this outburst. So I think my question is around like rage and love and thinking about them as productive versus paralyzing emotions, and what that kind of outburst in the book kind of did for you, how you kind of like, what prompted you to write it, how you felt after you wrote it, and kind of just a comment on like rage as perhaps an emotion of utility or emotion that can feel paralyzing, especially in this moment.
Just for our podcast listeners, that was a question about rage and love as productive emotions rather than paralyzing emotions. Should we take maybe two more and then we can do, or would you prefer to go one by one?
I'm happy with more.
Beautiful book, thank you for sharing it with us. Obviously the different characters that you bring to life, Ramsey, your father, your mother. Next time you speak to your mother, please express my gratitude and admiration of her. As an Iraqi woman, I understand her rage because of the gender roles that she and we in general inhabit. I don't know if there's a translation for gender in Arabic. Do you?
We say gendariya, but
Gendariya, but that's a transliteration rather than an actual word apart from a jins, which is sex. So the role that she embodied throughout your life, she towers like a very big figure in your story. And the influence, obviously you came out to her first, well, to your father, but she was the one, the constant throughout your life that actually facilitated you coming out to your father. And do you think that because of her suppressed rage, obviously, and the role that she was assigned to as a woman, that the influence of your mother will always be part of your story, part of the sort of the silent voice that women in that part of the world, without trying to, because I know there's a war happening right now in Iran to liberate the Iranian women and all that rhetoric, but it really connected with me your mother's gender and her gender role. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I'm interested, obviously, in her story.
So that was a question about gender. And broadly, do you think that your mother's suppressed rage will always be a part of your story? How has it shaped your story? One last question? Or we can just take those two?
There's one there.
Was there a hand somewhere?
Oh.
No?
No, I thought.
Okay, so we'll start with those two.
So on the question of rage, I mean, I think rage is a very productive emotion, and I think, as is love, I also think that they can be destructive. So I've been thinking a lot, actually, and this is also related to the second question around my mother's rage. I've really been thinking about how we must harness rage in a way that is productive and in a way that rejects the terms on offer and forces something else to be marshaled. And I think rage in that way can be generative. It has to be disciplined, I think, because it can also burn one down if it's not sort of challenged strategically and where it needs to go. But I think of it as a very productive emotion. So specifically in the outburst that you're talking about in the book, so the book, as I said at the beginning, was written as a letter. And so that was, so obviously at some point I had to break out of letter form, and the book became the book that you read, which is much more traditional as a memoir. And in breaking out of the letter form, there were instances where I felt that actually the addressing to Ramzi specifically held onto a spirit that I didn't want to let go of. And so I kept certain structures from that writing in what ultimately became this book, and this was one of the main ones because it felt like a fitting outburst that he needed to hear, but also that I was self-conscious about articulating to him, because I think for many reasons. One, because the political interjected so visibly into what was a love letter, and it's not that that's not a fitting interjection, but that it was a break in tone, and so it felt like there needed to be an apology to contextualize it, to sort of bring that rage back into the tone of what that letter was. So it was more instinctive. The more that I think, I mean, just now responding to your question, the way that I think about it is maybe it was also my way of trying to discipline it. So I'm sort of showing the rage, I'm articulating it, but then I'm trying to discipline it and coming back into the writing of that letter. I also think there's one other thing that's interesting in that section you highlight, which is that part of the reason I'm also self-conscious about the outburst is because it extrapolates from my personal relationship with him to the Palestinian struggle for liberation, to Iraq, to Sudan, and it's sort of drawing this through line between the very intimate and these macro politics, these waves of history, and I believe that I think revolutions are intimate and they're built between us as people, but there's something that feels self-conscious about making assertions that are so broad out of a relationship that's so small in some ways. So in terms of my mother's rage, I mean, I think that it's definitely shaped me. I think it's shaped me. I think it continues to shape me. I think there's something specific about women's rage that is because of the things you're talking about, because of the way the patriarchy silences it, and because of the way that it's then immediately placed in gender terms, that it's irrational, it's hysterical, it's senseless. It makes that rage part more productive, I think, more generative and more just than masculine rage. Because that also comes out often in very performative ways that are not sort of tied to these I don't know, broader systems that we're talking about. So I think there's something about growing up or being raised by a woman who was angry for good reason, shaped and shapes my politics. And you know, it's funny that you're sort of saying, tell your mother, I'm proud. You know, my mom goes everywhere in Amman telling people that this book is about her. And I think it's true. It is a book about her. She is very much the backbone of this book. And I think there's something about her own acceptance of her rage too. This sense of that her being ashamed of, or not ashamed is a strong word, but I know that she felt, you know, there's this image that, you know, this sort of the care, kind, and affectionate woman, mother who's sort of able to hold herself together in front of her child's tantrums all the time, which is, you know, certainly true in many cases, but also doesn't represent motherhood. I mean, I think women often struggle as mothers, either for economic reasons, for social reasons, for political reasons. And so here was a mother who was struggling economically, who was twice displaced, who was, you know, confined by the patriarchy. And of course she's angry. And how could she not be angry? But I think there was regret. There was often regret in her grappling with her rage, that she didn't do a good enough job, that she was too angry in front of us, that she wasn't contained. And I think it took her a long time it was a similar process to me, to really contextualize that rage and embrace it and see it as just and productive. So I think it's important for us to really think about rage as a political expression. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. If there are no more, go for it.
Would you consider, I know your linguistic choice is to have written the book in English, but would you consider translating it into Arabic?
Oh, it's coming out in Arabic.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in early 27. Early 2027, yeah. No, it was important for me that the book comes out in Arabic. Yes. It was, yeah.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Thank you for sharing sort of this conversation. My question is reflecting on something you said at the beginning of this conversation about wanting to think about writing letters to Ramsey as a kind of main form of writing a book. I was curious how it felt now, kind of feeling questions about, you know, this book and your personal life and your story with people you've never met and how that journey has been.
That's a question of, that's a question of how does it feel to be fielding questions about your personal life with people that you've never met before? I'm
starting to get used to it. I joke often that I'm actually a very private person. I never would have thought that I'd write a memoir, and I really resisted. My agent, when I was writing, when it finally turned from a letter into a book, he sort of kept pushing me to write more about my life. And at some point I could tell he was getting frustrated with me. And he said, you know, it's like pulling teeth. Getting you to write about your life is like pulling teeth. And I think I struggle to sort of open up in this way, but I'm getting to the place where I am starting to see this book as separate from me. You know, I can have these conversations about the book and about the characters in the book, but that's not necessarily, I mean, obviously they're autobiographical, but they're also, I don't necessarily feel that I'm oversharing. I feel like the book has captured what I wanted to say and what I'm sharing, and it's held back what I don't want to say and what I haven't shared. And I think that line is one that's clear to me now. I sort of released this book to do its work, and it's separate from me. So you know, it's practice. I'm getting there.
Any other questions? Are we good? Well, I guess just following up on that. I guess I wanted to say, like, also as somebody who writes, when I was reading this, I could tell that you were a private person, because in a way you've constructed this memoir through the eyes of other people, like your mother, like Ramsey, your father, and we know you through them. And then also towards the end, like I can see the ways that what is important is protected. And I also think that that's a good framework for thinking about how to do memoir, right? Like that memoir doesn't have to mean openly vulnerable to investigation.
Yes.
It can be also a political framework or even an artistic framework that helps you both to hide and to reveal, because we learn something about you in the way that you talk about Ramsey, but also he's not real in the way that you talk about him sometimes.
Right.
So I wondered what you thought about that.
No, but I also I do think that it's important to be very clear about what is to be shared and what isn't. And I think having that boundary, even if it's a personal boundary, is really important. I mean, I think that to write a good memoir, and I listen, I love memoir. It's a genre that I've read forever. I think it's an incredible genre. But you know, to write a good memoir, you have to share, and you have to go to places you're uncomfortable. You can't it can't just be, you know, a celebration of your life. That's not an interesting memoir. But I do think that it's important as a writer, as a memoirist, to be very clear about what it is that you are willing to share and what it is that you're not willing to share, and what the terms of debate are. Both for your own sort of control of the narrative, because you know, life is complex. I could have taken this in a million different directions. It was very clear what I wanted to write and the terms of what I wanted to write them in, and that gives me control as the writer on the narrative. It sort of then puts me in the driver's seat in terms of what it is what's the story that I'm telling about my life. There's multiple stories about my life. There's multiple stories about any life. So what is this container? What is this narrative that I'm writing? And what then, like in a novel, what is it, you know, what are the characters doing? How is this coming together?
And also, sorry, I wanted to then also to ask who you were thinking and writing with, because at the very end of this book, you give us a kind of paragraph of the people whose work was really kind of impactful for you. You talk about Rebecca Solnit, you talk about Mahmoud Darwish, you talk about Raja Shahada, you talk about a bunch of people. So, and I'm also asking that question in the context of Baldwin's Fire Next Time as well, because there's something about the political clarity and the energy and the honesty about questions of power that animate that more than his sense of, yes, he's talking to his nephew and there is an intimacy there, but he's talking as a warning. And I think there's a tenderness and a tender warning that runs through this book as well, in terms of the ways that you articulate different characters.
I mean, there were certain writers that I really thought with. So Raja Shahade, for example, his writing on Jewish strangers, how the colonizers come into Palestine as strangers into our domestic homes, or Rebecca Solnit talking about the continuum between you know, violence against women and sexual harassment and this femicide that's happening across the country, or thinking about this idea of malaise that Samir Qasir talks about in terms of this Arab malaise, this sense of apathy and depoliticization that's happening in the region, the sense of the fall from grandeur. So there were very specific concepts that I took, you know, Kristeva's abject, that I played with in the book. So these are people that I would, but the writers that I was thinking with is far more, you know, I was reading voraciously. I mean, I was reading memoirs in every, you know, indigenous Americans, queer folk, African Americans, you know, the black literature around memoir and using this genre. So I was reading a lot, and I think that was animating a lot of my writing. But there were specific concepts that I held onto that I structured the book around. And one of the biggest, actually the one that I was trying to remember, is Kenji Yoshino talking about covering of queer folks, how we have to cover and what it means to uncover. These concepts really helped me, you know, back to the point about constructing a narrative, helped me construct the story of my life and sort of have that scaffolding. Yeah. There's another question there.
One more. No, we do. What? Have we got time? Yeah. We've got time.
Did anyone else want to ask one?
Anybody else who hasn't spoken want to ask a question? No, go for it. Our last question.
Okay. grandmother's diaries,
Mhm.
and then there's like a point that you return to in the book, kind of to like build up an image of what her life was like. And I loved when you wrote about how they were quite mundane, and there was something powerful about their mundaneness, and how she never thought they'd be read, and then you're using them to build this archive of your own life. And it's maybe it's not, I don't know what the question is necessarily, but maybe what was that experience of kind of delving into her diaries? Was there anything that you found that didn't make it into the, or like that you found surprising, that you really loved being able to read? And what was it like kind of being able to archive her life when she didn't necessarily imagine that as a possibility?
Yes. Yeah.
That's the question around archiving and your grandmother's diaries and how they help to construct a narrative. But also, I guess, the texture of them. That's what the question is about.
Yeah, I mean, so I inherited the diaries after she passed away, and they, you know, they were not what I had imagined at all. I mean, if I journal every day, if you look at my journals, they're just a word vomit. You know, it's everything I'm feeling and thinking and struggling with. And she was incredible. She would just be. It's almost like a shopping list. You know, today we went here. That's it. It's just a fact. Like, this is where they went. They went to the sea on a Saturday, or this person got married. This person died. We went to this person's graduation, and there's nothing. And I mean, I guess there's nothing, but also there's everything. The fact that this is how she wrote and this is how she documented was in many ways how she lived. You know, very sparse, never taking too much space, being self-contained, being very methodical, categorical. But there was something, you know, for as sterile as they were, there was something that was deeply moving for me to sort of come back to these diaries, especially going back to Palestine, because and this is what I sort of write about in the book, it's sort of, her diary was proof of life, not necessarily that we wanted proof of life, but it almost that there was something tangible then, this life that she had lived in before the Nakba, that from that side of the history she would have never imagined possible. There was something about the fact that they were so mundane and domestic and uninteresting, actually, that you know, when you think about Palestine, now you're locked in the colonizer's frame, you're locked in this frame of catastrophe. But her life was everything that was uncatastrophic, everything that was mundane and normal. And so there was something that was very liberating, actually, in sort of going back to that and trying to imagine a through line, trying to imagine what the continuity of those diaries would be. And I mean, it still, you know, obviously I still have the diaries, and it feels like I still have a part of her. And there was a lot. I mean, there are things obviously that are not in the book, and it just gave me, I don't know, I feel like the diaries gave me an entry into her mind somehow. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tareq.
Thank
This
you.
is
Thank you.
beautiful. I loved it. Thank you so much.